Hello, this is Chris Ott, and this talk is on what is sometimes called the spiritual path, and it's on the subject of spirituality as it relates to my system of lenses that forms the world. First of all, before I start talking about this, I'm personally not a mystic. I'm certainly not a guru. I don't write self-help books. I'm not describing my experience of some spiritual path that I've been on. I'm merely describing these things as a philosopher and referring to other philosophers and some mystics too, what they've said about this topic. But I felt that I wanted to explain how it can be described in terms of my system of evolving perception, and the evolution of perceptual schemas that produce the phenomenal world, our experiential world that we enjoy and experience all the time and find ourselves in. I've never talked about this in my writing, and although I've had many conversations with a friend, Castellius Carvalhais, who was a collaborator early on, and we've talked about this subject a lot then, and relating it to Meher Baba's books on this subject of the spiritual path. And Meher Baba had a big influence on my thinking, but there were others, as I've said before, that also had a powerful impact. I'm going to talk about, I'm going to look at this from the vantage point of mainly the Greeks, the Romans, and then Meher Baba, actually. Okay, so first of all, let's begin with a slide. This is my system, okay? It's abbreviated. It's in this chart. It's in my book. It's not in my first book. It is in my second, and I use it to describe the evolutionary process of these schemas that gradually add content to the phenomenal experience until we actually find ourselves in it, supervening upon the natural laws. And then we have personal, what I call non-natural, man-made schemas that create the cultural experience through language and reference and meaning and things like that. And this produces the universe, both mentally and physically. And even our finding ourselves having emerged in that world of experience. When I look down, I see my hands, there I am, I'm in the experience, see? Or my thoughts are in the experience. Now that, which I call myself, a certain sort of, bracketed out amount of that experience I call me. But anyway, that's as far as I've ever gotten in my writing, because that's a lot to describe, and there was a lot to work out. But there are implications in this that I haven't talked about, and they're difficult, I think, to talk about. And once you start, you kind of have to finish, and I didn't want to get off my main point, which was the evolution of the phenomenal world, how it got here, and how we got in it. And in my second book, I talk a little more about why this happened and what the reason was and what the goal of this evolution ultimately is. And that pertains to this path, which I didn't get into there. But let's say all there is perception and ways of perceiving. These are the ways of perceiving. These are schemas. So a lot of times they're like algorithms of how you perceive. And when confronted with such and such data, you perceive it as such and such. And I've compared this to the principle in Hinduism of Maya, where you sort of see falsely. Now, each one of these, the first being time, space, and then various relations of time and space, which we call natural laws, and then things begin to supervene on them, and then through the media of our body, we add color and sound to those vibrations and so forth. And that's all described well in my book. But what I didn't talk about is that each one of these schemas, while it's building a world, it is building an illusory world. It's building a world that is apparent. So it is building a phenomenal world, and that's all. It's building sort of like a movie show. And that's sort of like similar to what people have been intuiting lately, the sense, and you hear about it all the time as the holographic universe idea, but that doesn't actually make sense, and I mentioned that in my book. This makes much more sense, because you don't have to account for, well, who made this hologram, and then you have a what's called an infinite regress, okay, of makers. You never solve your problem, you just sort of push it back. So that doesn't work. This works because you sort of get something out of nothing. You get the whole parent world out of what has been called, I believe, God. But this God is ourselves. It's different than we've imagined it in the past. And if you see my recent talk on God, you'll see how different this is from the concept of God that's come down to us, like from the Renaissance. All right. Now, what the spiritual aspect is that once this first goal is reached, that's not the whole goal of the universe, to create a universe. There's a reason that there is a universe, and it's by this process that we gain, each one of us individuals, which are really this, okay, this is parent, we gain self-awareness, or what's called consciousness. So this whole thing, in the words of Meher Baba in his main book, God Speaks, this is a consciousness factory. That's what the universe is. Evolution is a consciousness factory. All else is just a byproduct. Okay? What's really making is conscious. That's what God is seeking from the beginning, to gain awareness of himself. And to do that, he has to gain full consciousness. But once that consciousness is achieved in the human form, and whatever you want to say about people, they good or bad or whatever you want, they are aware that they exist, much more than any other creature. They are fully conscious, in the sense we mean it here. They're fully aware that they exist. They may be wrong about who they are. They may identify themselves wrong, and they may have all kinds of foibles and confusions, which are largely the result of these cultural schemas that they've acquired getting there. But they are conscious, and they are capable of achieving, beginning this process of involution, which is a return from where we've come, to where we've come. A return to God, which is our own selves, okay? And this is called, well, Meher Baba calls it involution, but we're going to see it's been called many things in the ancient past, okay? But most simply, it's called the spiritual path. This whole thing, in a way, is a spiritual path, but this is more building up the material world, and this is sort of disassembling it inwardly, going on an inward return journey. It's called a turning, where you turn and begin to contemplate yourself, the inner, not your ego self. That's this. You don't contemplate that. You contemplate who you really are. And if anybody's ever read I Am That by Nisargadatta Maharaj, the non-dualist Hindu philosopher of the late 20th century, you know that's his mantra, is like, I am not this, I am not that, and finding what your real identity is, who's the real witness, which is here. So that's kind of a meditation where we start taking the focus off of the world and money and relationships and all the things that distract us all the time, and we begin to pull our attention inward and then all the way back to here. Now I'm going to describe this the way, because I learned a lot from the ancient sort of proto-Christians. They were not Christian, but they were pagan actually, and it was in Rome. It was at the time of the early Christian faith, but it was not, it was kind of like a between the two. And it was called Neoplatonism. Now, Platonism is the following of the teachings of Plato, who lived about 400 BC. And these people lived and were very prominent around 200 AD, after Jesus' life. And the most important of them was named Plotinus. And Plotinus wrote, and there are some of his writings, or through one of his disciples, some of his teachings have survived. And Neoplatonism has also been called Emanationism. Okay? Now I'm going to kind of explain what Emanationism, because it will really, you'll see how it relates to those lenses that are producing the world. It's essentially the same idea, but they didn't have psychology, they didn't have evolution. There was a lot of ideas they didn't have in 200 AD that we have today that will be able to develop on this idea, which no one else is doing actually at the moment that I'm aware of. Neoplatonism is quite dead in philosophy, but I think it was incredibly important. You could categorize it more as a form of mysticism, and they were mystics. And I'm going to explain their concept of meditation because it's like a primer on this whole idea. It's not what most people today mean by meditation, by the way, but it's what the Neoplatonists took very seriously, and you're going to understand a lot from knowing a little about it. First of all, their concept of the universe comes from the sun, okay? If anybody who's read Plato, they know the story of the cave. And in the back of this cave, people are looking at the shadows on the wall in the cave, and then those are actually the shadows of forms that are being moved in front of a fire in the back of the cave. And if you leave the cave, you come into the bright sunlight, and that bright sunlight represents what's called in Neoplatonism the one. Now this idea of the one, the original being singular and unified, okay, and absolute, it has no attributes. It's just oneness. It's sort of like pure intelligence, I would call it. Well, that's what really originally was. That's what really still is all that is. But what about all the things we see around us? What is all that? Because that is not one, that is plural. Everything has parts, everything has, more than one side, things have their opposite. Black has white, or you can't even understand black except in contrast to white, etc. So the world of duality, we call that. So there's the world of non-duality, okay, and there's this apparent world that we look at. You way to understand this is essentially like you yourself are the sun looking out. But as these rays come out from you, they descend into lower and lower degrees of reality. There's reality and there's illusion, but there's degrees of reality. And this is the essence of Neoplatonism. And this is that ancient Neoplatonic representation of these spheres. And in the center you have the one, and then they would have these different less and less gradations of reality going out from it, and they emanate from it. But they are not apart from it. There is nothing but it. It's just that it appears. That's why my system actually works better, because you understand that it's appearance. It appears, but it's less real. And of course, you have thought is in here, the mind, the mental, and then on the very outer is the material, physical objects. They are the least real. That's straight out of Plato's cave. That's straight out of Plato's teaching. But in Neoplatonism, that's much more defined. Okay? Now, if we lay the sun over this symbol, we should look at one half of it. It begins to look a lot like my own charts, in the sense of here would be the I, the one seer, who is all that is, really. And then looking this way, and things begin to sort of peter off. Okay, but they are the radiance of this. They are not something else, okay? Just like the light of the sun is the light of the sun, no matter how far from the sun it is, and no matter how dissipated it becomes, okay? So here we compare this kind of iconography with my chart here of the one infinite intelligence conceiving, in order to find itself, all these perceptual schemas that are creating a less and less real but much more tangible world. Obviously, the seer can't just see himself, because it's sort of like the sun can't shine its rays on itself. It can only see what they reflect upon. So in this way, he makes this journey to find himself. And but it ends with him, let's take that as me, and I seeing the world and all my problems and all that. And that's the world. And someone else sees it too, and someone else from a little different angle, and have different cultural schemas. They color it a little differently. But it's essentially all the same world, because it's all the projection of these like natural laws. And essentially, by the way, this is extremely Buddhist, because you notice that everyone is in the one, and the one is in everyone, okay? And this, you can actually kind of see that here. So let's move on. I wanted to make a funny comparison between this idea and what's on our dollar bill, which a lot of conspiracy theorists are all freaked out about, but they shouldn't be. What it says on our bill in Latin is e pluribus unum. Actually, it's not here, it's on the flip side, I think. But it's on our coins. E pluribus unum, out of many one. All that meant was that when the founding fathers, this became a seal. Well, this was e pluribus unum was a motto from the very beginning of the American colony revolution. But all it meant was, out of all these states, together, they make up one federal, United States. That's all. Together we are one. But it actually had a more ancient meaning. And now, by the way, if you turn that on its side, it's practically my chart. But actually, this, if you go way, way, way back to one of the earliest forms of this e pluribus unum, comes from Heraclitus, who lived 500 BC. And his meaning was, the one is made up of all things, like I just said, the nation is made of all the states and the peoples of it. And all things issue from the one. So he was speaking mystically. The founding fathers weren't, but I just wanted to mention that. I thought it was interesting. I did a little looking into that. Okay, so as I was saying in the beginning, there's this, our focus today is all on evolution, and we're still trying to work it out and come to an agreement that the world evolved, but I think that it's pretty obvious that it did. But this evolution is actually an evolution of perception, as I explained in 2 books. And evolution is sort of the emerging out in appearance. So, the appearance is emerging from the perceiver. But involution is the turn and return to the source, okay? So the seer looking for himself. See, initially the evolutionary creature is just looking for food, looking for a mate, looking to survive, and it has to focus on the world. It's only in a human being, and a very advanced human being, who's had many lifetimes to chase his own tail, when he suddenly realizes and has an epiphany that there's something more, and that more is his real self. That's the meaning. That's even in Christian mysticism, but you wouldn't know it, okay, at church. But that is what is in the ancient teaching. Now, so how does that return happen? Well, return happens simply the opposite of the way we got here, and that is we begin to remove these lenses, okay, and we eventually find ourselves. We retain the consciousness that we've achieved through this process, but we become, we get true self-identity of who we really are. Because right now we think we're in the show, but we're really not. But let me go back now to the Neoplatonists. Because I was going to describe the meditation that they did. Now, these people took all this very seriously. They were mystics, and they weren't just philosophers trying to figure out a system that works to explain things. That's not what they were doing. There was some of that, and Plotinus mainly wrote as a philosopher. But the main thing was doing this. Now, what this meant, I'm going to just have to describe it. Let's say, initially, I look out and my attention is on the world and objects in the room and people and all the motions and all that. And that keeps me very distracted from myself, okay? So the first thing I do in meditation is I close or my eyes or squint my eyes and cease to pay attention to those physical objects, okay? Now what immediately appears when I do that? My thoughts. I start hearing all this chatter, all this worrying. I gotta pay my bills. My wife's gonna leave me if I keep all this meditating. Oh my God, is my dog gonna die? So chatter. Now, they believed that this chatter, and it's also pluralistic and full of manyness, okay, so it's false, was more real than the physical objects, okay? But now, what happens if you begin to pull back your attention from that? You simply have to not pay attention to that mental chatter, and you'll see the next thing. Now, but this was partly maybe due to their education. I have to tell you what they saw. They saw these, and they called these the forms. They saw something more real, more permanent. Okay, the same for everyone who looks, and their sense of reality was that which was the most permanent, unchanging, and those were for them it was geometry. Okay, because when you look at things in the room, they just you walk around, it looks like an object, but really when you meditate, you go back to what that object is composed of. It's composed of geometry, and that's composed of number, and now you're starting to understand why Pythagoras was a mystic, because they're looking back in those very permanent numbers. It's kind of like in the Matrix. Instead of paying attention to the girl in the red dress, Neo discovers, I can't remember the character's name, and he's watching the Matrix code, okay, on screen. He's seeing the somewhat more authentic code that's producing those outer objects in that red dress, okay? So that's what they do. And then ultimately, it's the turning around, and they do refer to turning, and you see yourself. Now that sounds kind of funny. It's only an analogy. You don't have to think of it as turning, because it's not literally turning. Nothing's turning. We're talking about attention here. The attention is simply withdrawn to the self. And in this, ultimately, theoretically, you should experience what's called apotheosis. Okay? Mystical union, God realization, self-enlightenment. Okay? These are ancient ideas. Nobody even talks about them anymore. Today, people meditate to just to feel better and relax. Okay? They do yoga in order to improve their health. But originally, these things had to do with this going in, and they had to do with achieving mystical union or God realization or enlightenment. Okay? This is a picture called Apotheosis of St. Francis, where he has the experience. He actually experiences Christ's own experience. So he becomes one with the master. So let's now close this up. And I'm going to do this a different way. Okay. Hi. Hello, we're back, and I've got here a different setup. Anyone who has followed these talks, which I've been giving over the last few months, is aware that I'm always making, coming back to this this metaphor, the central metaphor that I use, which is the metaphor of lenses. And as I've said, I originally was a camera assistant. And that's what camera assistants deal with a lot. Also film negative, and various film stuff. And my first degree was in film from University of Southern California, from where I have a bachelor's in cinema, television production. Now, I wanted to go over the same idea again using these props, because it makes it very simple. Let's start in the beginning of the universe. Before there was a universe, it was just perception. And then I qualify that in the second book and say it was really what we should call infinite intelligence, or the logos. And then it began to imagine ways of perceiving, and this caused it to perceive. Okay, didn't give it the ability to perceive; it was able to perceive, but it made it begin to perceive. Initially, there's no object to what it saw. It's only adverbial originally. It's all in my book in detail, and we have time and space and the laws. And then we have cultural. We have, he's bad, she's good, he's a Republican, he's a Democrat. It creates the whole world of all those divisions. And you got the world, okay? That's evolution. That's the evolution of perception. That's the emergence of the world phenomenally, meaning the experience of the world, how it arose, and how you ended up in it. That's very important. There wasn't a world and then you came along. You're part of that world. Involution is the exact opposite. It is the, in a sense, unevolving of this, but retaining the consciousness. So this, I just described that the ancient Neoplatonists attempted to do this through meditation, because they had essentially this very similar theory of the universe. But there are other methods, and they're called yogas, and or you could just I'm surprised Christians never noticed that to go to heaven, all you need to do is, be a Christian, go to church, and don't, and if you're Catholic, get a confession before you die, or an absolution, whatever they call that. And so why do saints work so hard? Why bother? What are they trying? What else is there to get? We're all going to get heaven, right? Well, I never asked a Christian theologian. Maybe he has an answer. But it's this. They actually have this path in Christian mysticism, okay? But anyway, Teresa of Avila talked a lot about it. And, of course, St. John of the Cross, okay? But let's now remove these. So we take the attention off this, or we remove it. But let's just say remove it because we don't see it. And this begins to remove the world. That's all. That's what involution is. Now we're involving. Okay, we're traversing the same ground that we did when we evolved. Now there's another way to look at this, and it is that By remaining conscious, as we back our attention from the material world, we begin to see the stages of the world as it formed that we could not see full consciously. For instance, we might have been a tree, or we might have been a bird, which are not very conscious. So what they were passing through, we're now passing through consciously, and this is what may be the subtle planes, what they talk about in some writing. Okay. So it's as if the evolution is actually kind of like a descent into Maya, or into illusion, but it's necessary in order to gain self-consciousness. And then the involution is the going back up the stairs by the same path that you took down, and you ascend and reach yourself consciously, and you don't need the world anymore, and the world vanishes. That's my talk on the spiritual path. As I said, this is just a bunch of theories and words, because I've never been on any path. I've never seen anything except the regular old world, and I'm a regular person. I just wanted to make sure nobody thought I was a hypocrite. Thank you very much. Enjoy your day.